little informal this morning, just because there aren't a lot of people in the room. If you guys would make my life easier and just sit at one of the seats over here with a mic in front of you, we can just have a conversation. Just, raise your hand to be recognized, and I can, so we keep order. But otherwise, that way we don't have to bounce around all the time. All right, so we're starting the morning looking at SB 437. And Mr. Sherman, you wanted to share a few things to start. So if you want to get the conversation rolling, we can go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to sort of give us the lay of the land, this bill really deals with two issues. One is the fact that municipalities were supposed to be sending their amendments to the BCRB for informational purposes for a long time now. 4, and I think maybe now 5, have done that out of the 100 plus that enforce the building code. Clearly, that was not working. All this bill does is hold their feet to the fire and say, everybody send them to us. If it was a legal ordinance when you passed it, you're good to go. We just check the boxes and no problem, no muss, no fuss. There's simply a clock in there to get them to send it to us. The other thing this deals with is...
If I can real quick, and if they don't do that within 60 days,
then
they can't enforce it. Right.
Right. And what happens next is up for grabs, I guess, but...
Well, so in other words, somebody's building something, it doesn't live up to the code that they were
Right.
trying to enforce, and then the builder's off scot-free as far as they can't be fined, they can't be anything like that because they haven't put this through the building code
I guess
review
that's
board.
the outcome of it. Yeah.
Okay, that's how I read it, but I just wanted to...
So part one of this bill is to deal with getting the municipalities to send those amendments to the BCRB. We check the boxes and they're good to go, provided they were legal ordinances. We just had an appeal that turned out that they never had an ordinance to create a building code board of appeals. So there's a lot of those kinds of things out there, I suspect, and this will flush some of that to the surface. The second thing that this deals with is at least 2 municipalities, Portsmouth and Durham, have adopted later editions of the model codes which are in the state building code. And in fact, Steve reports that now both of them have ordinances that basically say, we just adopt the new code, we haven't read it yet, and it isn't even published yet, but the day it's published, it's in effect in our town. My understanding is from 2002, when the state building code was created, that was never the intent. The wording in the RSA that allows towns to adopt codes that are not otherwise in the state code was put there to allow them to adopt things like property maintenance and housing codes. So things that the state code doesn't even deal with, not later editions of the codes that are in the state code. It really comes down to, do you want a statewide building code or do you not? Because once a town or a municipality can do that, all bets are off. Anybody can adopt anything they want, basically. So this tries to nail that down, and it was very difficult language to get our arms around to prohibit them from adopting later editions, but still preserving the right to adopt a property maintenance or a housing code. And others here have been involved in the process longer than I have and may have a different flavor on this. But this really comes down to those two issues: getting the municipal amendments submitted and prohibiting the model codes from being updated within the municipality.
So this would be why we changed the language, let's say in line 4 and line 5, from provisions and regulations to amendments. You're trying to use that language to attach it to a specific code that the state board has passed.
We need to remember that much of the language that's kicking around, particularly in the 674 series, was kicking around before there was a state building code. So, and 47, RSA 47:22 is a prime example. That language goes back, what, maybe to 1700s? A long time anyway. And it just was before the days of modern codes and, well, you can adopt very broad language rather than you can adopt a code. So there was some sort of housekeeping on the terminology as we went through this. You're correct.
Okay. You may have answered this. Line 6, the language that says, and this comes up throughout the bill, intended to replace.
Is that on page 1 or?
Page 1, line 6, yes.
Thanks, sorry.
So it gives 3 caveats,
Yeah.
right? Every time it can't be not inconsistent with or less stringent than, nor intended to replace. And then nor intended to replace is meant to capture.
So there's two ways to adopt the later edition of a code. Just say we adopt the later edition, or submit, 400 amendments that just change every section that changed in the new code. So that was the thing that was very difficult to get our arms around, and we put that in there. It's obviously a subjective term, although maybe not if it ever went to discovery. But that's what that's trying to do.
Okay. Yeah, there was language further down. I'm trying to remember where that. Maybe talk to that too. Okay, so
if you
you're putting that language in, and then basically trying to backtrack that, which seemed like the more contentious part of the bill, or not even contentious, but the one that raised some concern.
On the model codes?
No, on going back and enforcing that on
Okay.
at a time when it was legal for them to do it. But you had mentioned something earlier that caught my attention. So I was going to ask the question, Durham and Dover, I believe, correct?
Durham and Portsmouth.
Portsmouth. So they passed code during that open window before it was effective. Was part of that what you just mentioned, which is that they automatically update to the current code? They did that during that time?
I know that was the case with Durham, and Steve says that's now the case with Portsmouth as well.
Portsmouth did, yeah, when they specifically updated a lot of the codes, but the electrical code, they said, we're adopting the newest code going forward. They don't even know what it says.
And they did that in
system.
that open window.
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying. Okay, that's much more serious. I was going to say if they were, because we had testimony during the hearing that with the issuance of new adopted code, like we just adopted new code, that those codes would become obsolete and they would have to renew. But not if they've adopted. We're just accepting new code
If we don't have.
as it comes out.
Page 2, it talks about that reset, so to speak, on July 1st.
Yeah.
So, yes, that's what happens. Any of those codes that adopted in that gap technically would be able to stay because there was something in it that said any existing ones. So this is a reset for the fire marshal and his staff to be able to log everybody in, every town and city, and everybody start over. So if you don't have that, it creates an issue for those two that went in, or one that went in that 6-month gap, trying to beat that and adopting it going forward. So that was what Senator Carson was concerned about, was, they had the 6-month, when the codes are adopted, they get adopted in July, and they give a 6-month period to follow either code, the old or the new. And during that period is when they
They just said we're just going to adopt the new code immediately when it comes out.
They went through the process, they adopted a lot of building codes and updated them, and then in there, they adopted it on the electrical side, saying they're gonna adopt the 2026 code already. Hasn't even been printed, so, yeah, so that was part of the concern, and part of the concern we raised with Senator Carson was, that was just trying to get around it. That wasn't the intent, so this just kind of makes everybody start over from square one. And again, it's just trying to make them follow the existing law that is required now, it has been for years, to adopt amendments. Not that Portsmouth or Dover didn't follow that, but, it's, so.
So was consideration, I'm starting to understand this much better now. And it's a little bit more serious than I thought it was initially. Was consideration given when drawing up the language, as opposed to doing the whole adopted to prior to July 1st, 2024, or whatever, just saying that municipalities, local governing authorities can't wholesale adopt code, like they just can't adopt code to that level? Because that would address the major concern without it appearing like you're going back and doing something retroactively.
If you look at line 10 on page 1, you see us referencing a same or similar scope.
Yeah.
And that was an attempt to say, one, you know, from edition to edition, the scope is either the same or it's pretty darn similar. But also, there are alternative building codes. There are alternative plumbing and mechanical codes that are published. Some are used in the Western United States. Maine and Massachusetts use an alternative, goes way back, but it uses an alternative plumbing code. So similar scope, no, you can't go grab another plumbing code just because you like that one better than the one the state has. It's imperfect language. We grappled with it a lot. And if somebody's got a way to tie it down tighter, that would be good.
But also, one of the things we did with, if I may, the wording in there, the similar scope, most codes have a scope in the front of their code telling what it is. So we're not making up the scope. It's printed in that book. So if someone comes with another one and it's the exact same scope, well, then it's pretty obvious that they're trying to adopt an entire different code from that, right? Because whereas if it doesn't have the same or similar scope, then it makes sense for what they're trying to look at. So,
Is that the technical term scope?
but in some,
Section 1 of most of the codes, it's titled scope.
or
Okay.
purpose, that's why we put that.
That
in
that
there.
would
Yeah.
make sense. Okay, I
We
see what you're
looked
saying.
to find that to make sure that that was something that was referenced in each one for the most part to try to, so it's not the state building code deciding if your scope's similar. It's right there in the front of the cover. You open up the page 2 and it usually says it or something. So
Okay. Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I would agree that I think that as long as that's the terminology that's used, that it would make sense to use that language here. But that would be a different scope. Then there's what you do use for review, right? And you adopt the building code or the fire code. You are using a set of,
We
Set
have
of code.
eight codes within the building code.
right.
And
So
each of those
does
has a
that
scope.
does that keep them though from adopting a future code from the same organization that you're using, that language?
Same organization or any other organization, and that's the intent. Whether we've got it right or not, time will tell. Well, only to say that there will be people staying up nights trying to find ways around this.
No, I agree.
And I
Well, that's what has me concerned on that, on the bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3, is whether or not the language that's being used. I'm sorry. What was your name again, sir? Bill? Yeah. The concern that you brought up, I share that concern with the language as it's written here, and I don't want to give it maybe a little bit of thought to see if we could come up with something a little bit different, because it seems like as it's written, you're doing retroactive law, which is against the Constitution, which I think could open you up to lawsuit. I agree with that. I have some concern. I had some concern when I initially read it. And if I did, somebody else is going to think about it and potentially go after it. When really what I think is trying to be accomplished, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you just don't want people adopting wholesale code 2 years ahead of what you've adopted. So if you've,
It's two parts to that, though. One is what you just said,
yeah,
but the other is there are amendments that are not amendments floating around out there. This is what I like in my town, just go do it.
Mhm.
A town that's using the ZBA as a board of appeals, but never had an ordinance to do that,
Mhm.
which is what we just found on an appeal that came to us. So if somebody has a legally adopted ordinance and that, if there's a technical requirement, it's at least as stringent, not less stringent, we use funny words there, than the state code, which has been in the law now since there's been a state code. Check the box and off they go. No problem at all. Take us 30 seconds to review it.
Yes, Mr. Jimmy.
I think the backwards part of it in my head is just trying to. We've been asked for the last few years to compile a list of these are the state codes, building or fire. These are the state amendments, building or fire. And then, oh, by the way, here's where you can find the local amendments. And as I've described it, it's like a hide and seek game right now to try to figure out what Concord has, what Manchester has, what Berlin has. And, we've only got 4 or 5 right now. So I don't know how we, without being retroactive, right? That's the challenge. How do we get the communities to submit the local amendments and then give us the opportunity just to vet them to make sure they were properly adopted at the local level and they're not in conflict with the code. I think so that's this part two of that I think may be a little bit challenging. I mean, and our, from the Department of Safety perspective, I think it's up to you guys on how you want to do. Can the Portsmouths and Durham's just wholesale adopt the later, the 21, or now maybe coming up on the 24 codes when we're still a cycle behind, which for years now we're saying we want to stay a code cycle behind, and then there's a couple communities that are going further out. So like I think the general feeling I think from industry is to stop that behavior, right? Don't jump ahead. We've all agreed the code process should be one cycle behind so we can vet it properly. And then the flip to that is that I've been hearing is there's an ask to be a one-stop shop, so I can understand if I'm building in New Hampshire, whether I'm a homeowner trying to build a deck or do some electric work at my house, or I'm building the new parking garage and there's an architect that's out of state, then come and find this is where I need to go for New Hampshire. I just worked with a architect out of Ohio, very good architect, that solid on the building code, but missed that we had the fire code. We stumble into that a lot. So if we can create that one-stop shop where everything is for the design professionals and everything else, I think would make it a lot easier for the end user.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate both of the comments that you made, and I think, I mean, I can't speak for my colleagues, but I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. When we instituted the building code, the state building code, obviously we're overriding local code at that point. So the state has precedent that it can override local code. We can do that. But now there is state code in place. And so now we've got this interesting interaction between state code and local code. That wasn't the dynamic when we put the state code in place the first time. So that's a new dynamic to it. So I'm just wondering if there's language that we can use that would simply state the expectation that any local code, regardless of when it was written, now needs to be brought before the Building Code Review Board for approval, regardless, as opposed to specifying a certain group of people at a certain time in this little window. I just think that opens you up in a way that maybe isn't necessary. We may be able to find a different way to write it and get the same result. And to my two colleagues that are here, if you have other thoughts or a different perspective on this, chime in at any time. I'll recognize you for that. But yeah.
So when you're talking about the retroactives, Chair, are you talking about the July 1st issue or is that on page 2, line 27?
27 through page 3, line 6, right? I believe.
Yeah, that whole section there. So, and I completely understand what you're saying is trying to make sure that it's no matter what. And we thought that was kind of accomplishing that so that everybody has to resubmit it. If you submitted it prior to July 1st, and we picked that because we thought legislation would be done, possibly the bill would be signed, that would be the say, okay, here we go, and here's a reset button so the fire marshal can get everybody on board and do that. We weren't trying to be leaning to one side or the other, or, prejudice against one side or the other. In a lot of the towns who have some stuff in there, I don't know how many, I don't know, some of them all realize the process they need to go through to legally adopt an amendment. So for years, they've been doing this, right? And then all of a sudden, in the previous wording, it stated that anything prior to that stays in place. So that defeats the whole bill if we leave that. Now, if there's different wording, absolutely, I agree. But that was what that was intended to do, is kind of give us a reset. So I'm not sure if it does, but.
Yeah, no, I understand.
And another item that we've discovered is these towns that had maybe adopted their local ordinances back under the 674 regulations, they don't go back and review whether those amendments are in conflict with state code at this point now. They continue to enforce or administer those amendments. But I've often, and even with my community, gone back to look at the amendments that we've had prior and discovered that whole section of code has moved. So now I'm referencing the wrong section in code. So every 3 years, any community that has amendments should be going through to review all of their amendments that they propose and resubmit them to the Building Code Review Board. It just makes the most sense, and that way there you aren't in conflict with state code.
Sure.
Bill, have you got
Thanks, Peter.
have you got the capacity with your manpower and your working hours and so forth to do all that statewide review of individual communities?
I think so, and the fire marshal's gonna throw something at me if I misspeak here. I don't think that the time involved with these is excessive.
Okay.
We've been through several of them. Amherst, for instance, added a technical amendment on water quality, very straightforward. You could review that in a couple of minutes. Canaan, we worked with in detail because they had this mishmash between zoning and building stuff from back in the day. That took a little more time, but many of these will just be, go sort it out and come back to us. So I don't think it's a lot of time. And furthermore, this process is going to get rid of a lot of that stuff. They're going to look at it and say, it's out of date. Don't even submit it. We don't need it anymore. If I could add one other point,
Yeah, please do.
this is back on the later edition of the model codes. Med Kopczynski, who's the Municipal Association's representative on our board, reports that he's had calls from 6 municipalities looking to do what Durham and Portsmouth have done. And it's all part of this energy code tussle. So I think this is the time we've somehow got to get our arm around this, or just cash in a state building code and go back to the 1990s, which I hope we don't do.
If I may, Mr. Chair, every town before was using different BOCA codes and different building codes, so it was crazy to try to figure out who was following what. And, you know, like you said, you get into some towns, I testified earlier at the committee, where the inspector, even though I proved that I was following the code and was right, he still said, well, this is what I want. How are we supposed to run a business and do the work when, you know, you get that interjected someplace? So this makes sure it goes through the proper process. It's a what do you call it, board, neutral board that is made up of experts, as opposed to one person in the town going, this is what I think is best. Keep in mind, our building inspectors, for the most part, some are qualified and gone through requirements, but nothing in the state requires them to have any qualifications. Some of them don't know anything about electrical or plumbing or mechanical, and they're telling us what to do, and we have to go there and show them the code and prove to them, and then they still say, well, this is what I want. So it's trying to fix that a little bit too.
But it gives you an appeal process at that point. You can go to the Building Code Review Board and say, it hasn't been submitted properly, so you can't enforce it.
Exactly. Right now, we'd have
Right.
to take a legal process, which is expensive, so you just do it. Whereas now we could go to the board. If I go and I get a permit now, right? If this was in place, and I go and I get a permit, and they say, hey, here's a list. Like in Pelham, they have a list that you get with your permit of what he wants. Okay. I go, I pull up the website on the state building because it's been logged. I see they have it on there, and all those are there, or not. If not, I at least have some legal ground to say, hey, look, it's not posted. Have you followed proper procedure? It gives us some help to deal with that. That's
Right. It might not help the one guy who's doing some work in his home and they come in and say something because he doesn't know the code, but it's going to help larger construction
all these projects, all the
at the
workhouse
least.
housing,
Right.
workforce housing. I mean, there's a lot of them that have the little quirks, and it's tough.
It'll help everybody who knows this stuff, essentially.
Trying to be consistent.
Yeah,
Just, that's all. And
Well, all I'm saying is that a local enforcement agent would be able to go in and maybe pressure somebody to adopt code that wasn't required because they didn't know, the individual who's doing the work might not know that it had to go through the state, Building Code Review Board, so they're not going to be able to appeal it. And in that case, they're going to get away with enforcing code that's too stringent or whatever.
And also, if they didn't follow the process, say they're just saying, I want this, they're enforcing something illegally technically because it didn't pass. That's something that's been in the laws for forever. We found out about that they have to go through a town process, whatever that municipality is, to get it approved. They can't just say, here's a sheet, here's what I want. So this helps
Here's an aspect of this that I hadn't thought about. Um, we've probably got about 20 more minutes on this one. We'll have to have another morning anyway, but say there's a homeowner who is doing a renovation project at their house, or whatever the case may be, with a small contractor who doesn't really understand the interaction between the local code authority and the building code review board at the state. And we pass this. Say the local code enforcer requires that the builder use code that hasn't gone to the building code review board for acceptance, right? So it's not technically legal. The owner has to spend an extra $10,000 on the project to meet that code that wasn't legal. And then on the backside, they find out that it wasn't a legal code because it hadn't gone to the building code review board. Is there now civil action available to that person to recoup from the town or whoever the code agency was working for, to recoup that $10,000 from the town because they were illegally enforcing a code because they didn't have that enforcement power, or not?
I'm not a lawyer, so that would answer somewhere beyond the code process, outside of the code process. But you may be right. I might note that Connecticut mucked around with this several years ago and actually made the building inspector personally liable if they required anything that wasn't in the code. They got rid of that in a hurry because it just caused, I think, so much harassment. But there's always an ability at the court level to come after somebody that caused you harm.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it would, because we're saying it's illegal and they're doing something illegal. Just curious. Yeah. Well,
Building inspectors are indemnified from lawsuits and legal action, except in cases of gross negligence. So in this case here, if an attorney, if it's a civil suit is filed and they can argue that by, knowingly enforcing a code that's not adopted by the state, and we have this statute in place with the language that says you can't do that, then I think you could make the argument that that was gross negligence. And then the inspector himself would be liable, maybe not the town.
okay. Yeah.
And just to add on to that, let's say they did it before this passed. That homeowner still has that right and could go after that legally. It's just gonna be a longer process because it didn't go through and show that they didn't follow it. They may not know what they really have to do as municipality to be legally adopted. So even now, if they didn't follow that process, that homeowner still would have that, but the avenue is obviously more expensive, and you get caught in the middle of, I want my CO, or I'm gonna fight this for a year and not be able to move into my house, and that's
Right.
what happens, so.
Yep, that makes sense. Okay, real quickly, anything from the committee members? Okay. Just a couple notes that I made. There's no need to reference RSA 153 in this at all. There's nothing that would hit 153 that doesn't hit 155. Wouldn't have to go before the building code review board. We've got the line at the very bottom that says that everything's going to have to go by the state fire marshal for verification that there's no conflict with the fire code, but there's nothing that would arise independent of that. Is there? Yes, Mr. Chairman.
We tried to cover the fire code as it applies to RSA 47 for cities. The 674 series only applies to the building code anyway. So 153 sort of sat the way it is.
Okay, so 47 addresses 153. I didn't see it specifically. I don't know it well enough.
My understanding, and Sean and I have talked about this, is that cities have the ability to amend the fire code through RSA 47. Towns do not currently have the legal trail to be able to amend the fire code.
Right. So that's you're talking about the last line there, Phil. When you're saying 32 of the whole entire bill, 32 of page 3, you're saying that reference there to 4722 you think is enough to cover everything having to do with the fire code.
We tried to do that. Others ought to review it, make sure we got it right. But
Yeah.
We can take another look, but I think we captured it. But to Phil's point, there's a little. I've asked the AG's office to look in the path for a town to adopt changes, and I'm still waiting to hear back on them right now, but
Okay.
that one's a little vague. And I'm just trying to find, we found another spot in 155A. It talks about state building and the fire code.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can find that real quick. In 155A, which is the state building code, it also in the definitions talks about the state fire code and points it back to 153.1. So we believe it captures it both there rather than having to point in two different directions.
Sure.
But
Okay.
trying
Well,
to
I've got a little
trying
time.
to
I'll,
where the lawyer
I'll take
at.
I'll take another look at it too. And if I think there's concern, I'll run stuff by you guys before the next subcommittee when we move it out of here.
Perfect.
But I noticed that and just wanted to make sure that we didn't need to reference 153 at all. And then there is the question, and we can talk about it with the few minutes we've got left on this bill. Page 1. Yes, page 1, lines 24 to 29. There's a conflict with HB 1387 in the language because 1387 actually repeals this section. And my question to everybody is, if we get rid of that language in this bill, is that going to cause any problems to the overall concept or not? Because if we allow it to be repealed and then we just take that language, line 24 through 29, out of this bill completely so that it no longer exists, is that going to weaken this language and make it unworkable? Sure.
Just for the record, 1387 proposes to repeal this section,
Right.
which would leave this here. All this is a flag to other RSAs. It's not critical that it be there or not be there. We just wanted to make sure that this bill didn't get mucked up if 1387 got passed first.
Right. Okay. So I would prefer, and I can talk to Howard Pearl about it and make sure that we do it in a timely way that makes sense. But I would prefer to leave the repeal in and then just take 24 to 29 out of this bill through an amendment, and then it's not going to mess with it. Nobody's going to not pass this bill because that's taken out. Let me take a look at it. Yeah. Yeah, please.
We had reached out to actually have them do it the opposite. Take the repeal out of 1387 and leave this alone is what we felt was a better fix. I don't know if you're okay with that or not.
Well, the only reason why I say do it the other way is it takes a lot of stuff out of statute if it doesn't need to be in there, if it's not accomplishing anything. I'd rather take the duplicative language out through the repeal and then not have to have this being referenced. It would just take two sections out of statute that arguably don't need to be there. And so my question is, I would rather take two pieces out that don't need to be there if they don't need to be there, rather than leave them in and have them be unimportant. So my question is whether or not this is important to the bill, because I'm not seeing how it is important to the bill, but if you do see how it is, then I'm...
Because they're referencing, this is the reference to 674-51 and 47-22. I believe those go through and explain the procedures that counties, towns, and cities must go through in order to adopt an amendment to the state building code. So I think it's kind of important to direct them to make sure that they know that if you're amending the state building code in any way, towns have to follow the process in 674-51, and cities have to follow the process in 47-22.
But yeah, my point is, doesn't 674-51 and 47-22 already articulate that on their own? Like if you go to 674 and read that, doesn't it already articulate? And in fact, you can look up at the bill above it, right from the beginning, the local legislative body in 674 may enact as an ordinance, right, which is essentially what that's saying down below, or adopt pursuant to the procedures. So it's lining out that you need the ordinance already in place in order to pass any amendments to the building code, which is what we would be doing in this bill. So that delineates that. Are you concerned mostly just about delineating counties, towns, cities, and village districts specifically, as opposed to local legislative bodies?
Because I don't believe cities are captured are cities captured in 675?
No, it would be captured in 4722 though.
Correct, so that's.
So that what I'm saying is I think that RSA stands on its own. Like it already says to a city or town, you have to go through, applicable ordinance in order to adopt new code. So if both of those sections of RSA already say you need an ordinance to adopt the code,
Yep.
I'm not sure why we would need this reference to tell them to go look at those places to adopt an ordinance to adopt the code. But yes,
My personal view of this is I think it's a convenience, but it's not critical because as you said, those two sections stand on their own. We have some people looking at whether we can pull some of this stuff into 155A so it's all in one place. That's an exercise for another year. It's fairly complicated. But
But
I
it-
think
it
this is
makes sense,
just
I
a
think.
convenience right
Yeah.
now and it's not necessary.
okay.
And
Anyway,
offer a quick one.
Yes,
So I think 67451A is specific to, so the municipality may adopt by reference any of the codes promulgated by the ICC, I'm shortening it, which are not included in the state building code. So I think that was the, that talks about like the property maintenance code and those types of things. That's what's 51A talks about.
51A, we're proposing we just repeal it because it's mostly duplicative of other stuff.
So do we have, I guess the concern would be is is it clear enough somewhere else that someone could still do the property maintenance code or something, for using that as an example?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think we tried to cover that in page 1, line 8, 9, and so forth. So the local legislative body may adopt a nationally recognized code not included in, not inconsistent with, so forth.
Yeah, so I think it makes sense.
okay.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
So we're feeling okay about that? I don't want to
Yeah.
screw up the bill, is all I'm
No.
saying.
We can do that, right?
Would you be willing to give us afterwards? We'll just make sure that.
Oh
it's not
yeah,
necessary?
yeah. Like I
to
said,
make
we probably got a week before I've got to finalize it, but I will have to get an amendment put together for that meeting, so I'd need a few days. So like, if you guys want to get back to me with any concern by the end of the week, my only other concern is I've got to do this in conjunction with Howard Pearl over in the Senate because he's going to be doing stuff over there. So I've got to ask him to hold off until at least Friday or whatever. But if you get it to me after that, then I can work with him and we can get the language right and get it in time for an amendment to.
If by chance they were executing that today and they were trying to do that, would you be able to fix that still? Because.
Well, if he does that, I'll just do it the other way. So if the repeal goes, like if they get rid of the repeal, we'll just leave it as it is.
Okay. all right.
Yeah. So
'Cause I
if I
know
don't, if I don't get to them in time, it's no big deal. I'm just trying to clean up statute. If you're in the habit, which I'm sure everybody here is, of weeding through statute all the time, the less is more. You know, like it's just a pet peeve of mine over the last 4 years. So, perfect. Anything else from anybody else on this at this particular point in time?
Only that this is a difficult set of stuff. It's
Yeah.
hard to understand. It makes your eyes roll back, but it really addresses two critical problems. Whether we have a statewide building code or not, and this whole issue of local amendments and whether we can find them and that they're legal. So I would just hope that the entire committee and then on to the other appropriate bodies gets this thing through. But thank you for looking at it.
Absolutely. And I understand this way better. So I appreciate you guys coming in and talking me through it because there's stuff that I just wouldn't have picked up on just reading it. So that's very helpful to me. You mentioned that though, and it did bring up one more question that I just wanted clarification on. You had mentioned you can do it two ways. You can either adopt a future set of the code, right, later date, or you could just pass 400 little amendments in order to get yourself there. How does this close that loophole? What particular part of language are you looking to close that loophole? I understand the code, like the overall just adopting whole code, but the death
So-
by 400 cuts.
So our language is on page 1, line 12. The intent of this restriction shall not be avoided by the adoption of local amendments as determined by the building code.
Okay,
Review
so that's the section that you're looking to do that with. All right.
Board. I know that's going to cause us trouble, but maybe this balloon will float to the surface quickly and we'll fix it once and that'll
Right.
settle it. So
Okay, and so just once again, for my own edification, two things that you're trying to accomplish. One, old code that doesn't meet the requirements of this legislation because it's less restrictive than our current code that's been floating out. You want to flush that stuff out
Or
and
it
get
didn't
it
have a
off the books.
properly adopted ordinance.
Right.
That's the bigger issue.
Okay. And then obviously because that's the one side of the issue, and the other is restricting what they can do to adopt more restrictive code to one degree, or at least having to come through the building code review board and not being able to do it holistically, like just.
As the codes have gotten into energy and to a degree accessibility and some of the things that drift a little bit away from pure safety, what's more stringent gets harder and harder to think about. Because it might require more here, but less there, that kind of thing, so.
Okay. Great. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Appreciate it. We will let you know when the next one is. At least 24 hours notice. And I was 25 hours on this one, so. Yeah, no, I'll try to post it days ahead this next time. Yeah. This amendment basically just clarifies that they're leaving written testimony open for 7 days and not spoken testimony because that seems like a bad idea. So it just does. So that's basically what it does. In the original bill, it said 7 days, and it kind of left it vague. In fact, it almost seemed the opposite. Seemed like you had to submit written testimony immediately, but you had 7 days to give verbal testimony. So this just reverses that. And the original language is at the bottom of page 2 and the top of page 3 on the actual bill. So while Representative Boyd is looking at that, any concerns from the other committee members who have had a chance to peruse that language?
I don't have, if this works, seems like a good idea,
Mhm.
and the question is whether it's workable or not. Any questions about that?
I don't think generally that. Do I have to say my name for the record?
No.
Oh, okay. I don't think generally.
For the record, you wouldn't
For the
usually be
record,
sitting
I
at the
don't-
table either. So
That's true. I don't think we really put a cap on written testimony. I think people can just submit things to the boards whenever they want. So even with this language in place, we would probably still accept something in writing at any time.
I don't know, I would possibly disagree with that because any public hearings for rules that go to jug car, it says, you know, the written comment is requested by a certain date. They have a deadline. So I think this stays consistent with it. And again, it wasn't meant for them to have 7 days to have public comment spoken. That was never really the intent. I think Doug caught it. It was a good catch, and it was meant to have 7 days to send it in. So I think
And so I was speaking just kind of in general, but for rules, we usually keep it open for 10 days anyway,
okay.
just as a general practice.
So is there a reason why we wouldn't switch this to 10 days
I was
to be
gonna say,
consistent?
would it be best to stay consistent and just keep it that way?
It's an easy fix.
That was
We're putting
wasn't
an
my fault.
amendment
That
in
language
anyway.
was just there. So
Yeah.
Go to 10 instead of 7.
If that would keep it consistent with everything else,
I
would it
think
keep it
so.
consistent?
I don't know because like is it? Oh, that's an interesting. Is it like a 10 business day versus 7 calendar day? I haven't done the math in my head. I don't have a strong opinion on that either way. And we do generally keep the record open for 10 days, and if it's timely, sometimes we'll even accept it after that time period if we can still act on it.
Okay.
So.
Sure. To the best of my knowledge, it's 10 days because they literally give you the date. So if the public hearing is April 10th, they tell you by April 20th. So they don't really get into business or calendar days.
Yeah.
They just give it the 10 days. And it would make sense, I think, to keep it consistent. Then we wouldn't be trying to guess if you went to one public hearing as opposed to another.
Yeah, and I think if the requirement was 7 days and we're doing 10 anyway, probably just as a matter of policy, stick with that 10. So it's probably not going to make a difference.
Okay. So if it's not going to make a difference, we might as well keep it consistent for everybody else who isn't OPLC and doesn't know these things.
Sure.
All right. There's what you're going to do, and then there's if everybody knows that what you're going to do is what you're going to do. So, all right. Well, we actually have enough people here to act on things now, so that's good. We started without that, now we have it. So we don't actually have to have the official amendment in subcommittee. You guys can just authorize me to go get the official amendment for the full committee. But we should talk real briefly about the overall legislation, not just the amendment, but whether or not the idea of making sure that the public meetings are notified no less than 14 calendar days prior to the meeting. Everybody's good with the actual substance of the original bill. Is anybody opposed to the substance of the original bill? Okay, so we seem good with that. And then I would, I think probably the amendment is a good idea, but I'll entertain a motion from somebody on the committee on SB 369. Representative Schmidt?
Yeah, okay, but we are going to go to 10.
Yeah, we're going to go to 10. Well, you're making the motion, sir. Yeah, so we're going to go to 10 and we're going to adopt the amendment, the language of the amendment.
That's the motion.
Okay, very good. Do I have a second? All right, Representative Davis, all in favor? All right, we got 4-0 on that. Great. Oops. All right, we'll close up our time on 369 then, and we'll move over to 371. This is a fun one. Actually, once again, I don't know. I feel like the RSA changed between the last, I don't even know what I was looking at. I made a couple comments and I'm looking for the language in 329.14 and I couldn't even find it. So I think you guys changed the RSAs. Well, not you. Yeah. All right. So SB 371, don't think, do I have amendment language for this one for you guys? I don't think so. No, I don't.
Representative.
Yes,
did
I
you-
do.
Did you receive the email I sent you?
I
Oh,
did.
okay.
Yeah, so there's two different there's two different parts to this. There's the original intent of the legislation, and then there's all the stuff that you said. We ran it past the speaker. All of the other stuff that we'd be considering is considered non-germane. So we'll have to hold a public hearing, which we might do. I'm talking to the chair about it. So really the purpose of today's part of the subcommittee meeting is just to talk about the intention of the bill and whether or not we agree with that. And also we'll take a look at the amended language that you've proposed and see how we feel about that. And is the New Hampshire Hospital Association here for this one?
Yes.
Did you want to join us? Yes, she said she was going to be here, but she seems to be running a little bit behind, so.
Yes, she's on her way.
Is she? Okay, we'll wait for her then. Yeah, no worries. We can give her a few minutes. We've got an hour, so I don't think it'll take us that long. If she's going to be more than an hour, then the answer is no. All right. Okay, so 371. The purpose of this is to create a caveat for resident physicians from the 2-year renewal process for licensure, so that it would basically, well, technically, depending on what language we would go with, would give OPLC rulemaking authority to designate how long those licenses would be for. But for right now, it's every license has to be renewed every 2 years, and they're looking for an exception to that essentially. So we have everybody get. I passed around the amended language. Yes. Okay, so everybody has that, and I guess I would start the conversation directed to Dartmouth and the Hospital Association, which I asked ahead of time. One of the questions that came up at the public hearing, and I know will be an issue, it's an issue for me as well, is what is the specific hardship that's being created? So if you have that information, that would be great if you wouldn't mind sharing it.
Sure, I'm going to put my mic on.
Yep.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the questions ahead of time because it allowed me opportunity to connect with our medical staff office. So I'm a licensed attorney by training, and I have to renew my license every year. And so when the question was asked of me, I thought the same thing, like, well, wait a minute, can't these individual people just renew their license and take responsibility for it? But I was quickly corrected and reminded that we have over 450 resident physician providers who are really the backbone of the
Providers, not actual resident physicians.
resident physicians licensees who are
Okay, so-
providers, who are doctors.
Gotcha.
And they're really the backbone of the medical center in terms of overnights, on call. When you think about receiving care at an academic medical center, you're receiving robust care, and really that's because you're receiving care from training resident physicians. And so our resident physicians are working well over 80 hours a week. They're doing those odd hours, nights, weekends, holidays, etc. And so the one thing we can give them is administrative support and to help them with their license. And I just want to, we are so grateful for the work that was done on House Bill 655 last legislative session. So thank you to this committee, all the work that OPLC did to really streamline licensing. Sincerely, I mean, we take all.
We took it sincerely. I was just
Yes.
responding to Doug's face. That's all.
I know you did a lot of work, but
Flashbacks.
there are some when we have a large overhaul like that. Sometimes there are pieces that we just forget that should stay the same or that could stay the same. And I think this was just one of those that just kind of fell through the cracks. So we're really just looking to ensure that we can continue status quo and continue to license these providers in that kind of bundled way, as opposed to streamlining them into the every 2-year licensing processes.
So during the public hearing, you had mentioned in your testimony that it could be up to 7 years, but most licenses are
3 to 5.
3 to 5.
3 to 5. Yep.
3 to 5 in particular. So we're looking at maybe 1 to 2 renewals per person
Yes.
over the term. So as opposed to just having it for the entire length of their residency, we may have to renew it once or twice, because obviously the initial one is going to be the initial one, no matter what we do. Mr. Osterhout, what does the renewal process look like now under OPLC? How long of a process is it to renew a medical license? What do they have to do?
So typically, we're going to notify a licensee 60 days out, and then it varies from board to board, and we're working on consolidating that process. But there's a universal application form under the PLC 400s that has standard information, name, birth date, that type of stuff, and then whatever the board specific requirements are. But once you send that in and you get it to us, we have to take a look at that within 30 days. If there's any problems with it, we notify the applicant so they get a chance to cure. Once we have a full application, and it typically comes in right away that way, we can sometimes get it done same day, but I would say 2 weeks tops.
What I'm trying to gauge is how long it's going to take the administrative offices to fill out a renewal form. I know that the state has become very streamlined in a lot of things, and the ones that I get for my business, like the licensing renewals, are really easy at this point. some of them take me literally a minute to fill out and send back in. And so that's the other part of the hardship that I'm just trying to gauge from the hospital's perspective is, so you've got 450, but that's scattered over how many institutions?
That's just a dark.
That's just at Dartmouth.
Our medical center. Yep.
That's just Dartmouth.
Yep, so that's just our medical center. We also have resident training programs at Cheshire.
Mhm.
And then I don't represent the other hospitals, but there are programs across the state. So Ben can speak to the other programs.
Yeah,
that
if you wouldn't
exist.
mind.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'm just gonna refer to something I got yesterday.
Oh yeah, Mike's.
While Ben's, I'm going to give him some grace while he's digging out. I just have a couple things to
Yeah,
note.
please do.
So we're in, as of the summer of 2024, we're going to have 462 licensees just at the medical center.
Mhm.
And I just want to note that as Doug has noted, these are rolling, and so the renewals are going to be done every other odd year, I believe. But then every year we're going to have resident trainees that are coming in. So for the administrative burden for our med staff office is going to be tracking those annually, then tracking which ones are going to be renewed every other year. When did they start? So if somebody comes in 2024, they're going to have to be renewed in 2025 or 2027. So there's a rolling process here
Mhm.
where it would be much more it'd be much easier for us, frankly, to license a resident for the length of their residency, as we do in current practice.
So I got this from some information about Portsmouth Hospital's residency program. I do not have Concord Hospital's residency program, but I'm told that there are 8 family medicine residents that are there for 3 years. So a total of 24 family medicine residents.
You're speaking just of Portsmouth right now.
Yes,
Right.
that's right.
Okay.
And they just established their program not too long ago. So building upon it. And appears there are 24 for psychiatry and 30 for internal medicine from Portsmouth Hospital.
Okay, great.
And I wonder if OPLC would have an official number if you needed an official number of how many licensees you're looking at. And I don't expect that now. We didn't really go over that, but to look at a full spectrum.
So the other, the other important question. Well, first off, does subcommittee members have any questions at this point before I keep blathering on? Okay. Has there been any harm done?
Well,
Because the 2-year process would create some level of accountability to review, right? I mean, is there any harm done by allowing the license to go for as long as it has over the years that it's been doing that?
It's my understanding that there hasn't, and there certainly are checks and balances that are in place aside from licensing, including insurance credentialing, our internal policies and procedures. So I would say that to answer your question directly, the net benefit, including supporting our workforce, streamlining our business operations, far outweigh any potential concern, because there's been no documented concern to date.
If I may too,
Yeah.
Courtney, am I mistaken that previous to the 655 bill, residents were recognized for the term of their residency? It's just since the 2-year has been enacted. So it's not a foreign concept.
Yeah, that's why I was saying,
previously.
historically, have we had any problem with that kind of licensing? Because as a general rule, my side of the aisle is basically like, hey, like hands off as much as possible unless harm's being done.
Sure.
So,
And then
so that's a good argument for me personally, is all I'm saying.
Okay.
But yes, Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to be sure that I understand. So typically, as part of medical training, as I understand it, is when they finish medical school, then they are eligible for residency, then they find a place that is interested in hiring them, and they are going to be, then they come on board, they are going to be, as part of their training, they're going to be practicing medicine under the direct supervision, right, of, at least at the very beginning, direct supervision of a mature doctor who's been doing this for years, let's say, okay? And so they would then get a license as part of the process that we're talking about. And that license and their residency would last for, what, 3 years we're talking about generally?
Yeah, it depends on the duration of their residency. As if we're talking about the current practice, how we've done it here in New Hampshire, it depends on the duration of their residency. The Board of Medicine licensed them for the duration of their residency. So, for example, a family practice resident will have a residency for 3 years. A surgeon could have a specialty surgeon could have a residency for up to 7 years.
Right, that's different.
Yes, and you're right. They do practice under supervision and guidance of an attendee.
And their license is a residence license.
Right.
The other thing to keep in mind is given that the programs are 3 to 5 to 7 years, kind of odd numbered years, when you apply a license for 2 years, you've essentially afforded them the license of a residence for maybe an additional year if you were to have to renew every 2 years. Do you see what I'm saying with the way the math works? You start on year 1. If you were expected to fulfill a subsequent license for residency to complete your last year, that residency license is good for 2 years. It just doesn't match up with the term of the programs. So that's the other thing that makes it more in line with the way things work for a residency program.
Okay, so, go ahead, Steve.
Suppose a resident doesn't finish their residency in their skill. What if they want to move to another hospital? Where did they start over again? Did they take a competency exam? What's the story? And how would OPLC deal with something like that?
That is a great question. I'd have to follow up with you on that question. I don't have all the answers. It's a great question. I would just say that the license is for that person. They're not licensed as a Dartmouth Health Medical Center resident. They're licensed as a resident in New Hampshire. And so I would suspect that their resident license could be, they would carry that with them to Portsmouth or Concord, where there's another residency program. I don't, that's my guess, but.
Now, do the people in residency, is it going to affect their ability to take board certification?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, everyone has to make individual decisions, right, about where they work and then when they're gonna sit for their boards. I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
But they would be licensed for that period, for that institution, right? So,
Well, they would be
they're-
licensed for that period for their residency proper. There's nothing on their license that says they're a Dartmouth Hitchcock resident. It just says Jane Smith, resident physician license.
The
But-
license,
but-
just for clarification, because I might answer your question,
Go ahead.
Peter. In statute, as soon as that agreement is terminated, so does the license.
right. But I mean,
Presently.
that's the idea. They would be coming on board at that institution, even if it doesn't say, but they would have some kind of a contract for the institute, in this case, for Dartmouth. But so I'm familiar at least with the concept of residency, but we also said Portsmouth. You said what did you say about Concord, Ben?
Concord Hospital.
They have a program too.
They have a program
Residency
too.
program.
How about one with Douglas in Dover?
No. There are other, there is interest in additional residency programs in the future at various sites. I think there was a proposal in 403 to create a residency program in the North Country. So, the idea is when you can bring providers out of school to New Hampshire, give them that exposure to our state, the hope is they would stay and be here, and we want to make it as easy for them as possible.
Obviously, it's a question to the advantage of the institution to have the workforce that they need because, for example, I understand if you're working kind of, that's the, not as a stranger movie, where they're working kind of around the clock. It's kind of like grueling, right? But you need people at all hours because people have accidents.
Absolutely.
There are crimes committed or, whatever, round the clock. You need to have somebody there available in the middle of the night as well as work business hours, right?
Yes.
So it's important to have the people there. Also it's not like you have something where you have a standard practice. Somebody comes in, whatever their medical emergency is, requires that team to be working on them for as long as it takes to stabilize them, save them, whatever, and admit them and so forth. And that could be for, it can't be limited to a specific time period, right? They've got to be there for that person as long as it takes. And if they're,
And longer sometimes.
right?
Peter, Peter, to be fair, I've never heard a resident complain about the hours that they have to work.
I have. So anyway, I read it in a book years ago. I saw it in a movie years ago. But anyway, the thing is that it's to benefit of the institution to have people available under those circumstances, but it's also to the advantage of the individual practicing physician to be able to have a place to go to and continue their training program, but also they're making a living right off the bat and so forth, or
And,
getting
and,
paid for it anyway.
and one additional element, Representative, the community benefits from these
Well,
resources
clearly,
also.
the community
course.
benefits from having a hospital there. That's one of the reasons, for example, when the question of the continuation of Frisbee Hospital as an institution, there was some talk of them closing. And I remember thinking, here's the community of Rochester, 30,000 people roughly, a few thousand more, and Dover, 10, 11 miles away, similar population, and suddenly the hospital, Frisbee, potentially closing down. Now all those people are suddenly going to have to go 11 more miles to come to Dover or go someplace else for their treatment, and that clearly would not be in the interest of the community, to bring it back to the point of attack that you raised. But the thing is, so this is a traditional thing, but I think of Dartmouth as a training institution. That's where they're studying medicine at Dartmouth. But we don't have a similar situation in Portsmouth, to my knowledge. So they would be, and you said it's not happening at Wentworth Douglas. It is happening at Concord. So, but I was not aware of the fact that we were doing residency in Dover, which is why I asked, and you said that's a negatory. But Concord and Portsmouth, yes.
Yes.
Okay. But they come in and they would be at that institution for that period of time, and presupposing that everything is going well, they'd be there for that period. And to have a license and for residency for that period would obviously be advantageous and not have to renew during that period. Again.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Yeah, the argument could be made that it would be better for anybody who's practicing to not have to renew their license, but no, I know. I'm just playing with you, Peter. So one other question that I have before we get into the kind of guts of the bill itself to make sure that it actually functions. Fees, Doug, for this type of license? Any idea?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to look at the 1002s, but if it was traditionally done, so two comments. One, if it was traditionally done the other way, we probably wouldn't notice much difference financially. And I think the other comment is and this would probably come from the governor's office too, right, licensing is for public protection, not for fee generation.
You're speaking to my heart, Doug. Yeah, you've been with me long enough. I hear you. Just covering all the bases. Well, no, because it was $200 per license. They have to be licensed, right? One way or the other, they have to be licensed. So the license is there for public safety, but the cost of it gets shifted to other people. If it's not being collected from one group, it has to cover the cost of the board. So it's going to be covered. It's going to be collected at 450 resident physicians for Dartmouth. If it were $200, you're talking $90,000 every renewal cycle.
And I think that's a really good point because there are a lot of shared costs, right,
Mhm.
for disciplined prosecutors, having the hearings officers, those kinds of things, and
Right.
that wouldn't necessarily be covered after that initial licensure. Now, again, I'm not the finance guy,
Right.
but that is a good point to raise.
If you could just get me that information just so I have it, that'd be helpful. I'm not sure that it'll be a determining factor at all. I just like to have it.
So if we're going to have it for 3 years instead of the typical license, so we're going to prorate the cost for, on the basis of getting a longer license, it's going to cost more, right?
I think we would have to reflect on what's been done in the past, and maybe work with OPLC to see what that looks like. But
That's an interesting idea, though, Peter. I hadn't thought about that. That's all I'm saying.
What do you think, Doug?
That's something I'd have to run by Lindsay, but potential exists if we're going to have to account for 7 years worth of
Right.
time instead of 2. It might have to be adjusted.
It's a good point.
We're not going to have the same price for 2 years as for 3 years or 7 years. That makes no sense.
Right.
Not to me, anyway.
if I may, it may just be wise to take a look at how it had been done historically.
Yep. Yeah.
That's all we're asking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, not that people usually complain about the pay at that point once you've reached that level, but it would probably be, I'm assuming physicians and surgeons would pick up the rest of the tab. So they'd be picking it up in their futures as opposed to in the present. But okay, so there's that component of it. All right, so now if I may, unless there's any other comments on the content of the bill or the intent of the bill from the subcommittee. If you want to look at the draft legislation, because I looked at this for a bit this morning, and I think what Doug's written up makes a lot of sense. Basically, in number 2, it just says that licenses shall be valid for 2 years from the date of issuance, except for physicians' residency licenses and apprentice licenses, which were the two things. The apprentice licenses were already in this section. We'd be adding the physician residency licenses to it. The duration of the physician residency licenses and apprentice licenses shall be established by the office in accordance with 541A, timely income, and it goes on from there. If we were to go with this language, Doug, I had a question right off the bat for you. 329.14, what was it? 329.14.5C says this. It says training licenses shall be confined to activities performed in the course of the qualifying residency or graduate fellowship training program. We'd want to keep that. Shall expire automatically upon licensee separation from the residency or graduate fellowship training program for any reason, and may be issued on a restricted or conditional basis. So we would have that in statute, and you would also have rulemaking authority. Would that could potentially be conflicting?
Well, we could always draft rules in accordance with the statute.
Okay. So it'd be fine to leave it there, and then that would be the guidance for
I think
you
so.
setting it. Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that we weren't doing anything. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a little confusing. The apprenticeship licenses, now we're talking about the electricians we were talking about in the hearing, is that correct?
That is correct,
Yeah,
because
okay.
they're already in 310A8 as an exception, so
Right.
they'd have to stay in 310A8 as an exception. We would just be adding the physician residency licenses
Okay,
to
do
it.
we want to put in apprentice license, electrician apprentice licenses? Do we need to do that, or just we're assuming?
Doug, how's that kind of
I
laid
think
out?
so far it's working. I don't know if we need the clarification. Is it limited to just, Steve may know better than I do. Is
Steve?
it limited to just electricians, or does anybody else have a 1-year apprenticeship?
Right now, I think we're the only ones that have the 1 year. They have a single year, but they let, like, think mechanical lets it go for 2 years. It doesn't really check. Ours just says you got to show that you've done the schooling before you can get it again. It's always been that way. So we just, if you give them a 2-year license, they don't have to show they've done the schooling, and it's going to really mess up that whole process. So
Yeah, I don't think anybody's going to be like, well, the apprentice licensing. Well, see, that's a good point, Steve, because right now it's 1 year for that, and nobody's going to be like clamoring to have to renew more often. But if it's not laid out in statute, somebody could potentially start a licensing program and have a way around it, but then it would have to go through rules.
Correct.
and wouldn't it, if, and I'm just asking, if you leave it like it is, given the ability if somebody else wanted to change it to that, not having to come back and do it, as opposed to just saying electrical apprentices, it gives them the ability to deal with any apprentices throughout the OPLC if they change it. So I would think it's best just left like it is, but as long as we can address our issue, I'm not going to fight for everybody else.
Anything else, Steve?
It'd be a different chapter for electrical than for any other, so it'd be a different chapter, but it wouldn't be a bad thing to put the extra word in there.
So I'll just throw it out there real quick again, because we're really laid back during this subcommittee meeting. Still, just come through the chair because so I don't jump over people. Courtney?
I'm sorry, I have to go. I'm still working on that being in 2 places at once thing, but I haven't mastered it yet. So I have to
Okay.
hop back over to the State House.
Can we get
Any
your
other
name
questions?
again?
Yes, my name's Courtney Tanner.
We have it here.
Yeah, I can get in touch with you
And
if I do.
text
But
me, call me, email me.
thank you for getting the information you did. It was very helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you
So,
so much. Thank
yeah.
you for your work on this.
Yep.
As advertised. You said you were on your way and I was going like, yeah.
Thanks to Ben.
Then like 5 minutes later, you were here.
Technically, she was late, but that's okay. Thank you, Courtney. Appreciate it. All right. Anything else on the language that's proposed in this amendment? I think it's cleaner than the original bill personally. I'm not sure that it actually changes anything. I'm not 100% sure. Doug, do you have thoughts on what it was changing? There was one thing in there. What was it that I felt like was different?
Well, Doug, you're going to be looking at this, right? You're going to be looking at this, and if any thoughts occur to you, you'll
Yes,
get
sir.
back to us.
Yes. I don't know if you want to move on, but I did want to flag, and you and I had discussed it in the Senate right now. House Bill 1622 and House Bill 518 both have bills that are amending this same paragraph. So right now we have 3 bills amending the same paragraph. My recommendation in the Senate was to pull it out of 1622 and just move that language over to 518. But now we've also got this to contend with. If their decision here, I could also potentially work this language into that and just get it all in one place, depending on the decisions made. Just putting that out there because we've got
as opposed to-
we've got 3 bills with 3 different RSA 310.8 paragraph 2s.
Sure. So what you're saying, as opposed to pushing SB 371 through, just take the language, attach it to. Are both of those bills in the Senate?
Both of those bills in the Senate.
Then I don't like it.
Understood. The other thing I could do is grab the language from that we worked on with DOJ for 1622, and we could drop it in here, and I could just put this language. The problem, the things are happening.
The only other thing to take into consideration is the potential for adding the other language that we've talked about, which would be a standalone bill. We have to have a public hearing on it. If we do, this would fit in with that. Maybe if we can just make sure that we work together to make sure the language doesn't conflict in its final
Okay.
state.
And I'll just put together one paragraph that kind of merges the 3,
Sure.
and then we should be in a good place.
Okay. Because I did want to give some consideration to, and we'll talk to Lindsay about it, but I do want to give some consideration to a price adjustment if we go ahead with this, just so that it's reasonable. We'll be saving them time, but they'll be deferring the costs for other providers. Any other comments at this point from the committee?
You'll coordinate with.
Yeah. Is anybody just flat out against the idea of opening up this exception for resident physicians? Okay. So the subcommittee's working under the assumption that as a subcommittee, we're okay with the overall concept of the bill. We just have those few things that maybe we may want to work in. Then we'll call another subcommittee meeting with an amendment. We can take a look at an official amendment and go from there.
No, because I'm nodding, but I can't see whether, I can't see whether Fred is flashing his eyes at you. That's why I wasn't implying that you were asleep. I wanted to get your attention because you were looking that direction.
Okay. Very good. Well, then I will say that we'll move in that direction, seeing that there's no evidence of harm being caused by the longer licensing over time. It doesn't seem like there's any reason not to do that. It is kind of a unique set of circumstances. As long as in my opinion, as long as we're willing to adjust the licensing fee component of it to be accurate, unless Lindsay has something to say about that I'm unaware of. And then we'll probably just, then for your edification, we have other language coming that OPLC has recommended. We may have a public hearing on and attach it to this. It's not in any way going to be something that's going to put this at risk. So it's pretty general stuff, language fixes and things of that nature. So, well, and Steve. Yeah, the four of
Oh,
us.
sorry.
We really appreciate your support on this. Thank you.
All right, guys. End of that, and we've got an hour and a half until regular committee. So 1 o'clock. We'll see you there.